Hey guys, Matt Easton here. So I've talked about maces lots in the past, and one of the things I noted about maces is that this type with a metal shaft, very often actually the metal shaft is hollow, and a lot of recreations of maces that I've seen over the years, they've made the shaft solid, and this makes the weapon far too heavy. If we look at the original ones from the 15th and 16th centuries, this type of flanged mace for fighting, essentially for hitting people in armour, practically always they have a hollow shaft, and my good friend Fabrice Cugnot, who is a French bladesmith, he's done a lot. He also is a doctor. He has a PhD in weapons, amazingly, in medieval weapons, and his research suggests that actually, whilst most of these metal shafted short polearms, essentially striking percussive weapons, whilst many of them are hollow now, perhaps some of them had some kind of inclusion in the shaft, such as wood inside that over the years has shrunk and fallen out or decayed. I'm not so sure about that personally, because examples I know, this is modelled on one in the British Museum, and this incidentally is made by the Knight Shop, or the HEMA Shop, same company, here in the UK, and I went and took measurements of the original of this in the British Museum, which is what they made this replica of. It's not a completely faithful replica, I have to say, but it's a fairly cheap and affordable. If you go on the Knight Shop's website, you can see it's a fairly cheap, I think it's about £50, fairly cheap mace. But that is closed at both ends, so there is no way that it could have an inclusion of wood inside, or that the wood could have come out. We can see that it's hollow, and it's always been hollow. Now, an interesting thing, as I'm sure lots of you do, have cutting parties. Cutting parties are where you have some mates around, you take sharp swords and you get various objects. It could be water bottles, it could be tatami mats, it could be cardboard tubes or pool noodles, or indeed it could be things like pig's heads or bits of animal, and you chop them up to see different types of cuts, see how different types of cuts function, hopefully improve or tweak your cutting form and technique and see where you're doing things wrong. And occasionally we get percussive weapons out and hit things with percussive weapons. Now, for a bit of fun, we often have, when I have a cutting party, we have a warhammer and a mace and things like this lying around, and indeed spears and other things as well, and we hit the water bottles and whatever we're using with those things. And when you hit a water bottle with a warhammer or a mace, the water bottle tends to explode. That's assuming you hit it. Some people miss because these weapons are fairly short compared to swords, and people who are used to using swords, often when they first swing a short weapon like a mace or a warhammer, they actually miss with it, which is a bit embarrassing, but you're learning from that process and you're remembering, okay, short weapon, I've got to step closer. But an interesting thing happened at the last cutting party that I had. A friend of mine took a swing at the water bottle with this mace and did miss it with the head, but hit it with the shaft. And this is what happened. Quite to my amazement, the shaft of the mace, though I'll just stand out of the way so you can see a bit clearer, actually buckled. And that, now we think it may have actually hit the wooden cutting stand rather than the water bottle. But I have to say, people underestimate water bottles. Try punching a water bottle, it's a fairly hard and heavy object. So it's possible that purely the momentum of the water bottle did that. Now, how has this happened? So, essentially we can see there's an impact point on this side. Please excuse the little bits of rust on the weapon, that's my own negligence. And what happened is, try and catch the light on it, we found that this tube essentially has a seam running up the side here, and when that squashed there, so the impact came about there, it forced the seam, I don't know if you can see there, it's actually starting to split open. So where this steel has been rolled around and brazed, joined, closed, the tube has been squashed, and the natural weak point where the brazing is, has popped open. And I now have one bent flanged mace, which I'm not particularly upset about. I actually have another flanged mace because, you know, who doesn't have two flanged maces in their life? I can still use this even though it's bent. And it was interesting. It was an interesting experiment. So, you know, there we go. And I'll probably get a nicer quality flanged mace at some point. But I found it very interesting from a historical and archaeological point of view because this is a more or less traditionally, well, I won't say traditionally made, but the end form and general kind of assemblage of parts of this mace is fairly similar to the example in the British Museum. In fact, the main differences are that the flanges on this are too thin. The flanges on the actual original one are quite thick, and whilst these look a bit like blades, the original one are more like flanges. They're not blade-like, they're quite thicker. So I suspect the one in the British Museum is quite a bit heavier than this. And of course, it's possible that the hollow shaft of the one in the British Museum is made of thicker steel than this, and I suspect that that's the case based on this. So there we go, I've learned several things. One, hollow shafts can squash if you hit the shaft instead of hit the head. They can squash, they can bend, they can buckle, so that's a weakness of hollow shafts. But equally, it's quite likely, in my view, that the hollow shafts on originals that exist are probably made of thicker gauge steel than this one is. But I would still rather have a thick hollow shaft than a completely solid shaft most of the time, at least if it's this diameter, because a solid shaft would make for an incredibly cumbersome and slow weapon. And you have to remember, when you're striking something, you want to be able to get a decent amount of momentum in the thing, and if it's too sluggish, it's going to be moving too slowly. So it will hit with more mass, but it will hit more slowly. And velocity, any of the physicists out there will remind me, is very important, which of course it is. So there we go, guys. I would say if you're getting a hollow shaft, then hope that it's a thick hollow shaft. I don't know what the lesson to take away from this is, but I thought it was interesting. Bent mace. Cheers, guys.
Click subscribe now and also follow us on Facebook.